The boy came down the mesa barefoot, dusk light staining his ankles with ochre dust. He carried nothing but a frayed burlap sack slung over one shoulder, too empty to be heavy and too worn to hide the trembling of his arms. His feet were cracked and calloused, but quiet, as if even the earth hesitated to remember he passed through it. He was 9, maybe 10, though hunger had rubbed the years thin on his bones. He had no name anyone still spoke aloud. Not since his mother vanished beneath a storm-swollen river and his father rode north and never turned back. By the time he reached the outskirts of Ash Hollow, the sky was a bruise and the prairie wind had died down to a whisper. He stood behind the smokehouse of a feed store, watching the last light settle on a weathered church steeple, and the glow of lanterns flicker in windows like distant stars he couldn't name. The town was small, tucked into the palm of the hills like a secret someone had tried to forget. He did not expect kindness here. He did not expect anything. Across from him, a saloon exhaled fiddle music into the dust. Men leaned against the hitch rail, boots scuffed, voices thick with whiskey and heat. The boy kept low, moving through the alleys like wind through wheat. No one looked twice. A shadow without boots is easy to ignore. He curled into the space between a livery wall and a woodpile, his knees pulled close, eyes open. Sleep came in short, shallow sips. He dreamed of firelight and the smell of venison stew, of a woman's hand smoothing his hair back with the kind of love that didn't flinch. He woke to the clatter of hooves and the sudden hush of morning. The woman who found him didn't speak right away. She was gathering kindling behind the boarding house, her hands steady and square-knuckled, a gray braid tucked into her collar. She saw him but said nothing, just stood there a moment, weighing silence like a blade. Her face was seamed from years of wind and labor, her eyes the color of burned sage. He held her gaze, not defiant but not afraid either. She nodded once and turned back toward the door, left it open behind her. The boy waited, 5 breaths, 10. Then he rose, brushed pine needles from his shirt and stepped through the doorway. The warmth hit him first. Then the scent of beans cooking slow on a stove, of coffee gone slightly bitter from sitting too long. The woman was at the counter, her back to him, spoon in hand. She ladled food into a bowl and placed it on the table. No words, no welcome. Just the sound of a chair leg scraping against the floor. He sat. A storm passed through him at that table, quiet and invisible, a surrender he couldn't name. He ate slowly, chewing each bite as if to prove he belonged to the living. The woman washed dishes in silence, her hands red from the water, the window light turning her profile to iron. When he finished, she gave him a blanket and pointed to a cot near the stove. "You can stay the night," she said, her voice low and flint-dry. "Tomorrow we'll see." He nodded, already curling beneath the wool, eyes wide. He did not ask her name. She did not ask his. Outside, the wind returned, gentle this time, rustling the eaves with the sound of something old trying to speak. Inside, the boy slept with one hand fisted in the blanket, as if afraid it might vanish. The woman sat at the kitchen table long after he slept, her fingers folded around a chipped cup. She watched the fire ebb in the stove and listened to the small, even breaths from across the room. Her chest ached in a way it hadn't in years, as if some forgotten door inside her had opened an inch, enough to let in the cold, and the boy's presence pressed against it like rain. She told herself it was nothing. Just a child passing through. But in the morning she made him eggs. The eggs were dry at the edges, pan-scrambled with pepper and salt, nothing more. The boy ate without looking up. He held the fork like it might disappear if he set it down too long. The woman drank her coffee standing up, leaning against the counter with the window behind her. The dawn light was pale and still. Neither spoke. After the dishes were washed, she handed him a pair of boots, too big, the laces missing but whole. He stared at them. "You'll work if you stay," she said, "not charity." He nodded. By noon he was sweeping out the boarding house porch, shoulders hunched, the broom bristled and worn. He didn't complain, didn't ask for water, didn't pause unless she told him to. Her name, he learned, was Ruth. Not from her mouth, but from a man who stopped by asking if she'd mended his shirt. He called her Miss Ruth and tipped his hat toward the boy like he was something wild that might spook. Ruth didn't offer explanation, only handed over the shirt and took the coin without smile or thanks. Days stacked up like firewood after that. The boy mended fences, hauled water, emptied ash from the stove. Ruth kept her silences sharp and close, but she watched him in quiet ways. How he touched the broom handle gently, how he flinched when dogs barked too loud, how he never asked for more than what was offered. She never asked where he'd come from, he never told her. He spoke little, but when he did, his voice was soft, like wind through dead leaves. He said please, he said thank you. And once, after Ruth pulled a thorn from his foot, he said her name. She froze when she heard it, not because he used it, but because of how he said it, not like a stranger, but like someone trying out the shape of home on his tongue. By the second week, Ruth found him mending an old chair on the porch, hands precise, jaw set in concentration. She watched from the doorway, a rag in her hands, unsure when the stillness between them had shifted into something less like distance and more like peace. She found herself leaving the front door open, found herself setting out extra beans at supper, unspoken habit forming at the edges of her day. She hadn't lived with anyone since before the war. Since her own son vanished on a trail west, swallowed up by distance and silence. Letters unanswered, graves unknown. She buried her softness with the last of those letters, folded beneath a floorboard she no longer dared to open. But the boy had a quiet gravity, like something fallen from the sky and too stubborn to break. He didn't fill the house with noise or need. He simply stayed, and his presence stretched into the walls like sunlight, like time. One evening, the wind brought with it a bruise-colored sky and the smell of rain. Ruth was stringing onions by the pantry, her fingers aching from the damp. The boy stood by the window, watching the clouds gather like a judgment. "Storm's common," he said. She looked at him, really looked. His shoulders had straightened some. His eyes were clearer now, like the fever of hunger had passed and left behind someone steadier. "You afraid of storms?" she asked. He shrugged. "Used to am." That was all, but the way he said it held something else, a deeper echo. Ruth turned back to the onions. Her own mother had said storms washed things clean. She'd never quite believed it. Some stains, she knew, didn't lift. That night the rain came hard. Thunder rolled like distant cannon fire. The boy sat near the stove, reading from a primer Ruth had found in a chest upstairs. She hadn't asked if he could read. He hadn't asked if he was allowed. He just did. When the thunder cracked close, he didn't flinch. But Ruth saw the way he gripped the pages tighter, the way his breath caught like a bird trapped behind ribs. She poured warm milk into a tin cup and set it beside him. Still no words, just the act of it. He looked up at her, eyes dark as rain-wet earth, and nodded. Later, long after the fire died down and the storm passed eastward, she stood at the edge of his cot, watching him sleep. His hand curled beneath his cheek like he'd forgotten to guard himself. She reached out, hovered a moment, then pulled the blanket higher over his shoulder. Outside, the world held its breath. Inside, something old and frozen shifted. She didn't know his past, didn't know the names of his dead or why his feet had gone so long without shoes. But in that moment, Ruth understood something she hadn't let herself feel in years. She was no longer alone. Spring came slow to Ash Hollow, dragged in on the tails of rain and thaw. The prairie turned soft underfoot, and the cottonwoods along the creek put out pale, tentative leaves like hope cautiously unfolding. The boy, still unnamed, still quiet, grew into the rhythm of the place, his hands learning the language of wood and soil, his limbs filling out with the muscle of honest labor. He rose early without being told, fed the hens, chopped kindling, checked the traps for rabbits. Ruth gave him more to do and fewer words to guide him. She'd begun to trust that he'd understand, and he did. More than once she caught herself looking toward the porch, expecting the shape of him there, broom in hand, or sitting with his knees drawn up, watching clouds like he was memorizing their slow, impossible drift. One morning, a rider came down the trail, long coat flapping, hat low. He was dusted with travel, beard thick with grit, and when he dismounted outside the boarding house, Ruth felt something cold rise up in her chest. He didn't ask for a room, he asked for coffee. Asked if she'd seen a boy, dark hair, thin, about so high, might go by Caleb. The boy's head lifted from the coop where he was gathering eggs. He stood still, sunlight catching the edge of his jaw, and then he disappeared back inside the henhouse. Ruth looked the rider over. His eyes were pale and quick, his smile practiced. "No boy like that here," she said. "You sure?" he asked, drawing out the word. "I'd remember." He tipped his hat, chuckled low, and drank the coffee slow before riding out the way he came. The dust took longer to settle than Ruth liked. She waited on the porch until it did. That night she found the boy in the woodshed, arms wrapped around his knees. He didn't cry, but she could see it in the tightness of his jaw, the way he blinked hard and refused to meet her gaze. "Was it your father?" she asked, keeping her voice even. He shook his head. "Then who?" He didn't answer, but he held out his hand, palm up. There was a scar there, thin and crooked, running from thumb to wrist. Ruth stared at it, heart slow and heavy. She didn't ask again. "You're safe now," she said. It was not a promise she often gave. Too much of the world had taught her not to believe in safety. But something in her needed to say it, if only for him to hear it out loud. In the days that followed, he seemed quieter, more watchful. Ruth gave him space but not distance. She left an apple on his pillow, sharpened his pencil when it wore down, added his socks to her wash without comment. He began carving small things from wood, a bird, a fish, a crooked little horse with one leg shorter than the others. He lined them on the windowsill above his cot, each one an unspoken prayer. One afternoon, as spring warmed into early summer, Ruth took him into town. He hadn't been further than the creek since he arrived. His boots, now patched and worn soft, scuffed the dirt road as they walked. People looked. Some smiled, some didn't. At the mercantile, Ruth bought him a new shirt and a bar of soap shaped like a rose. He turned the soap in his hand, bewildered. "For you," she said. "You don't have to smell like barn hay all your life." He smiled, a small thing, a flicker, but it stayed. They walked home slow, the sun high, a hawk circling above them like a silent witness. She told him about the plants that grew along the road, wild mint, yarrow, chokecherry. He listened with the reverence of someone who'd learned to find comfort in knowing what to call things. Back at the boarding house, they shelled peas together on the porch. He told her quietly that his mother used to do the same, said it without flinching. Ruth didn't press. But she passed him the bowl when his was full, let her hand brush his in the exchange. The next morning, she found one of his carvings on the kitchen table. A bird, wings outstretched, made from scrap pine. On the bottom, carved in small, careful letters, was a word: Ruth. She stood there a long time, her hand curled around the bird's body, the weight of it light and infinite. In a world that had taken so much, here was something given. Not out of pity or need, but choice. She put the carving in the cabinet beside her mother's brooch and her son's last letter, closed the door gently. Outside, the wind moved through the trees with a sound like breathing. Inside, Ruth began to remember how to feel. Summer burned through the valley with the weight of a held breath. Days stretched long and golden, dust rising in waves off the roads and settling into the folds of Ruth's skirts, the boy's collar, the grain of every worn floorboard. The air hummed with bees and creaking porch chairs, and the sound of the creek shrank to a trickle by midseason. The boy, still without a name he would share, had begun to laugh, not often and never loud, but in moments. When the rooster tumbled off the fence trying to impress a hen, when Ruth dropped a jar of pickles and blamed the ghost of her mother, when he learned to whistle and startled himself with the sound. He read now without stumbling. The primer had given way to a tattered volume of fables, the pages soft with age, the corners foxed. He sat under the elm beside the well, reading aloud sometimes to the cat that had taken to curling against him like it had always belonged there. Ruth watched from the window, one hand on the sill, a faint ache blooming behind her ribs. It was not pain. It was the remembering of something she'd once surrendered too easily, joy, unlooked for and undeserved, showing up anyway. But peace, she knew, did not hold forever, not in a world that demanded payment for every scrap of grace. It was a Sunday when the trouble came. They had gone to the chapel at the edge of town, Ruth in her plain dress, the boy in the blue shirt she'd bought him. His hair was damp from washing, combed neatly, though the cowlick defied order. He sat beside her, back straight, eyes alert. Most folk there had grown used to his presence, but there were always those who didn't look too long, didn't speak at all. That morning it was the sheriff's brother, Amos Hale, who broke the quiet. "Funny thing," he said too loud, voice thick with heat and old beer, "how orphans just turn up in good people's homes, like weeds." Ruth's jaw set. The boy looked at her, not scared, just waiting. Her hand found his under the bench and gave it the smallest squeeze. "You grow anything yourself lately, Amos?" she said, voice calm as still water. "Or just busy yanking up what others tend?" Someone laughed, short and nervous. Amos reddened and sat back, but the room had shifted. Judgment had walked in and found a seat. After that, things changed. The boy stopped going into town. He stayed close to the house, spent more time by the creek, skipping stones or carving quietly under the cottonwood. Ruth didn't push. She just set meals by the window, left the door unlatched, kept the fire warm even when the nights didn't call for it. One evening she found him sitting in the garden, the rows of beans tall beside him. He was carving again, something long and narrow. She sat down beside him in the dirt, skirt bunched at the knees, and waited. After a while he held it out to her. It was a flute, or near enough, rough, unfinished, but the hollow of it was true. "You play?" she asked. He shook his head. "But Pa did before." The word settled between them, low and unexpected. It was the first time he'd said it, Pa, not in passing, not like a ghost, but like someone real and buried. "He used to make music when it rained," the boy said it helped the ground forget. Ruth turned the flute in her hands, felt the grain of the wood, the shape of his memory tucked inside it. "Then maybe you ought to learn." She found an old hymnal in a drawer, and they spent the next weeks whittling reeds and blowing sour notes into dusk. He learned fast. He always did. And by the time the heat began to break, he could play a tune that sounded like longing. In late August, a letter came, postmarked from Kansas, addressed in a spidery scrawl. Ruth read it on the porch, lips pressed tight, hands steady. When she finished, she folded it once, set it on the table, and went to the garden. The boy watched her from the steps. When she came back in, she didn't say anything, just made tea. That night, she didn't sleep. The next morning, she told him the truth. Her son, James, was alive. The letter was from a nurse at a veteran's home. He'd lost most of his memory, taken a bullet near the end of the war. He remembered her name, asked for her. The boy sat still, face unreadable. "You goin'?" he asked. Ruth nodded. "I have to." He swallowed. "You comin' back?" She didn't lie. "I think so." He nodded once, slow. "Can I stay?" She looked at him, and all the years of her heart came forward at once. "Yes," she said, "you can stay." She packed 2 days later, left the keys with the neighbor, and pressed her carved bird into the boy's hand. "Don't forget to water the onions," she said. "I won't." She rode out at dawn. He stood at the gate, alone again, but not the same, not hollow, because he knew now that she would return, because she'd said so, because she'd meant it, and he believed her. The house held a quieter kind of stillness after Ruth left, like breath drawn in and waiting. The boy, no longer as slight, no longer nameless in his own mind, rose early and moved through the routines with steady hands. He watered the onions, fed the chickens, scrubbed the porch when the dirt climbed too high. Each task felt like a promise. The first week passed in slow circles. Days warmed and cooled, wind shifted through the willows, and he marked time by the slant of light across the floor. At night he played the flute, notes drifting through the rafters like moths drawn to the memory of fire. The cat followed him from room to room, mewling once each dusk as if counting the days herself. He spoke to Ruth as he worked. Not aloud, but in thought, told her about the fox he'd seen slink by the woodpile, about the bread that burned because he'd dozed off by the stove, about the way the storm last night had creaked the roof like it was grieving. One morning, a girl came to the door. She was barefoot, maybe 12, hair in 2 braids and eyes rimmed with something harder than childhood. She didn't knock, just stood there, holding a sack of flour with both arms and blinking like she'd run too far and forgotten where she meant to stop. "You Ruth's boy?" she asked. He hesitated, then nodded. She said if anything happened to bring this to you, Mama been sick, we owe her for the willow bark. He stepped forward, took the sack. It was heavy. He could see the way her hands ached from it. "You got shoes?" he asked. She shook her head. He paused, then went inside and came back with a pair of sandals Ruth had kept for summers, too small for him now, might fit her. "Take these," he said, "and water, sit a while." They sat under the elm. She drank from a tin cup, told him her name, Lenora, and that her father was gone to find work near Dodge. Told him she kept bees, hated milk, could shoot a hawk mid-flight if her sling held true. He said little but listened well. When she left, he gave her a carved rabbit. "For your mother," he said. In the quiet that followed, he realized something had shifted again. People had begun to look to him not as a shadow or mystery, but as something rooted. Someone who stayed. By the second month, others came, the widow needing help lifting crates, the man with a busted cart axle, the boy from the tannery who just wanted to borrow a book. The house was not lonely, it was waiting. He read Ruth's hymnal some nights, the words strange but beautiful. He wrote her letters he couldn't send, folded them neat, tucked them under the mattress. He carved more animals, left them on windowsills, fences, under doorsteps. Gifts for no reason other than the quiet joy of it. One evening, with the first breath of autumn in the wind, he heard hoofbeats on the road. He rose slowly, wiping his hands on his trousers. Stood at the gate like he had before, only taller now, steadier. It was her. Ruth rode up tired and dust-covered but whole. Her eyes found his and softened like the soil after a long drought. She dismounted stiffly, favoring one knee. "James," he asked. "He's not the same," she said, "but he remembers how to smile." They stood there a moment, two halves of the same waiting. "You held the house well," she said. He looked down, then up again. "Wasn't hard." "You left it full." She reached out and touched his shoulder, not to guide or test, just to know the warmth of him again. Inside, the stove was cold. The cat purred against her boots. Ruth sat down at the table, folded her hands. "You ate?" "Not yet." "Then let's do that." He set to the task. Fried eggs, bread warmed over the coals, tea brewed thick and dark. They ate in silence like they had that first morning, but this silence was different. It was full of all they no longer had to say. When he reached for the salt, she watched his hand and said, "You groan." He nodded, and then, after a pause, "I've been thinkin' I'd like to keep the name Caleb. If that's all right." She looked at him, the name fitting around him like a coat he'd grown into. "It's more than all right," she said, and from that moment he was no longer the orphan with no shoes. He was Caleb. He was home. Autumn thickened, crisp and golden, wrapping Ash Hollow in its fading heat like a last held breath. The trees went amber at the edges. Smoke curled gentle from chimneys. The wind began to taste like harvest. Caleb woke early still, but now Ruth's footsteps joined his. They moved around each other in the kitchen with the ease of long familiarity, one reaching for flour while the other stoked the fire, a glance enough to say what didn't need saying. Some days James was there too, sitting quiet on the porch, whittling with hands that trembled when startled. His memory was patchwork, but his smile came easy. Caleb learned to sit beside him, not asking much, just letting the presence of one another be enough. Ruth had softened in ways she didn't name. She still spoke plain, moved with purpose, but now she laughed when the hens chased each other or when Caleb made bread that refused to rise. Sometimes she sang, not songs with words, but low, humming tunes that wound through the house like threads pulling everything together. One evening, a wagon broke down on the edge of town. A family traveling west, two young children, a mother worn thin and trying to hide it, and a father whose eyes carried the weight of bad luck and too many dry seasons. Ruth took them in without fuss. Caleb helped unhitch the mules, set the children up with blankets in the loft, boiled beans with salt, and a sprig of wild thyme. The next day, the family offered payment. Ruth waved it off. "We all been empty once," she said. And Caleb saw how the man's hand lingered on his hat brim before he nodded, eyes full of something too tangled for words. Later that week, Ruth brought out a set of worn tools from the shed. They had belonged to her husband once, long ago. Caleb turned them over in his hands, hammer plain, a blade dulled by time. "If you're to stay," she said, "you'll need something that's yours." He built a small table first, then a bench, then shelves to hold jars in the pantry. Each thing he made was strong and plain, built to last. At night, he played his flute under the porch awning. Ruth would sit near, shelling peas or just listening, the sounds threading through the dark like a lullaby meant for more than sleep. Sometimes he told her dreams, one where the prairie was covered in snow, and he was walking with someone who had no face but carried a lantern that never flickered. Another where he flew, barefoot still, above a valley filled with birds that sang names he didn't know. She listened, always, and once said, The ones who have been lost the longest dream the truest. The seasons turned. Winter came. It did not come hard that year. The snow was kind and the wind behaved itself. They celebrated Christmas in quiet ways. Ruth lit 3 candles, one for her son, one for Caleb's mother, one for whoever might be alone in the dark. They sang 2 verses of a carol neither of them liked much, then sat by the stove eating molasses cake. James gifted Caleb a pouch for his carvings, stitched by hand with crooked seams. Ruth gave him a coat. It was hers once, patched at the elbow, lined with flannel. He wore it with pride. Spring returned again, and with it came life. A pair of barn swallows nesting above the porch, buds on the cottonwood, the smell of damp earth ready to begin again. Caleb stood taller now. His voice had deepened, but not too much. His eyes stayed kind. He was known in Ash Hollow, not feared, not pitied. Known. One afternoon he found Ruth in the garden, knee-deep in soil, her hair loose from its braid. "I've been thinkin'," he said, brushing mud from his hands. She looked up, brow raised. "I might take on the carpentry full-time. People have been asking." She nodded. "Good. And I want to build another room, for more folks passing through." Her face broke into something close to a smile. "That's a fine thought." He hesitated, then added, "Wouldn't be what I am without this place." She stood, knees creaking, dusting off her apron. "You were always what you are, Caleb. This place just gave you room to show it." That night he carved a new bird, wings wide, eyes fierce. He placed it on the mantel. Below it the house settled into sleep. Outside the prairie exhaled. And inside, where a woman once forgotten had learned again to feel, and where a boy once barefoot had found his name, the lamp stayed lit, not out of fear, but so others might find their way.